Good morning. We have the week after Easter, and you're still here, and I'm glad you're still here. It's a great week. All the weeks are great. Have you ever said anything that you wish you hadn't said? All right, we'll have the invitation now, please. Sometimes you say things that don't come out right. You know what you had in mind, but what you had in mind somehow got confused with the words you spoke. I've got some headlines. These are in the newspaper. So let's read some headlines. Mayor Paris to homeless, go home. Where are they going to go? Midget sues grocer, cities belittling remarks. Cites belittling remarks. Threat disrupts plans to meet about threats. That's like the global warming conferences, There have been a number of them that have been canceled due to weather. Federal agents raid gun shops, find weapons. No joke. State prison to replace easy open locks. I would hope they replace those. Now this is great. Diana was still alive hours before she died. This is about the Queen of England, of course. Senior luncheon will no longer include lunch. Cows lose their jobs as milk prices drop. And my personal favorite, one-armed man applauds the kindness of strangers. I have a feeling that the articles below the headlines were nothing like what we laughed about and what the headlines actually said. But I don't know because I didn't read the articles, just read the headlines. But sometimes we say things that don't get through. Sometimes we say things, and it may be preconceived. Test. How about turn me up a little bit, Bob? Would you turn me up a little bit? There we go. Is that better? All right. Sometimes we say things that somehow or another get blocked in the process of interpreting or whatever. And, a lot of times, and particularly in Bible times, it is the preconceived notions that get in the way. In other words, you say something, but the person has in their mind what they think they're hearing. And they don't really get the message. And this happened to Jesus Christ, of course. It happened in Isaiah chapter 9. Jesus was to be the king. He was to be a new king. Isaiah 9, verse 7 says, of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Well, he did come, and he did establish his kingdom, but the people didn't think he did it. He established his kingdom. And they didn't really call him king other than tongue-in-cheek. When they hung him on the cross, they had the sign that was painted that hung, along with him. Jesus, the King of the Jews. Well, why didn't they understand his king? Why didn't they understand anything that he said about his kingdom? But it wasn't just the bad guys. The very good guys didn't understand his kingdom either. Well, it's understandable in some ways because the Jews had been, in their recent history in 600 years before Jesus, they had kind of a bad run of kingships. You remember when we read in the story how Israel and Judah, got off into idolatry. They had one bad king after the other. Both Israel and Judah did. There was supposed to be just one kingdom, if you will, but they desired an earthly king. God was supposed to be their king, but they desired an earthly king. And so God gave them the best that you could find, the best guy you could find. But they got off into idolatry and other things like that. Well, the Syrians and Babylonians, came and overthrew Israel. They had Babylonians with Nebuchadnezzar, and Cyrus was a Persian king, and they overtook. Then there's Alexander the Great and the Greeks, and later, were the Egyptians. And after that, the Syrians. So for about 600 years, the Jews had not had a king. There was a special time about 174 BC where the Maccabean revolt took place. And they kind of reestablished their nationship then, but they had so many taxes and tributes that they had to pay and all this to keep peace that it wasn't really freedom that they had. But when the Romans came in, and they came really strong, and they really overtook just about everything that you could name, every country you could name. The Romans now were in charge. And when Jesus came along, when he was born, the Romans were the rulers. They were in charge of everything. And so even though Isaiah and all the prophets just about it had prophesied something about the kingdom, what they had in their minds was not at all what he did. What they had in their minds is that because the Romans were the government in charge, they said, fine, and we're going to have somebody that will throw off these evil dictators, evil conquerors off our backs. We are looking forward to getting Messiah because when he comes, we know everything's going to be great. But Jesus came, and he didn't teach like a king. He wasn't born like a king. He didn't fit their bill for a king at all. And in fact, he wouldn't even fight for the kingdom. So they just rejected him, out of hand. They rejected his kingship. But they misunderstood what the prophets had prophesied about the kingdom and about the kingship. And so this is kind of what we're reading about now in the story. The king is present, and in the story, this time we're in chapter 24, and we read about the parables that he taught, and we read a lot about the miracles that he performed. So many so, and really it's not really an adequate lesson in that regard, because you need to really understand his miracles, and you need to see the people that he met and the people that he healed to get a scope or to get a perspective on who Jesus really is. So they gave a good sampling this week, but they didn't do good as far as exposing who Jesus really is. And I think we have a lot of lessons that we could teach on this subject. But Jesus came along, and he's speaking about a kingdom of some type. And you remember there's many, many parables where he said the kingdom is like this or the kingdom is like that. And a lot of parables start with the kingdom is like. And then he said things like the mustard seed and other, the kingdom is like a sower that went out into the field and he sowed his seed and so forth. And he went and taught a lot about the kingdom. But they didn't really get it. They didn't really get the kingdom concept. They didn't really have in their minds, they had in their minds an earthly kingdom, and it was not earthly. So he taught the character of the kingdom. The character of the kingdom. And first of all, it's a spiritual kingdom. The character of the kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, not an earthly kingdom. John 18:36 said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place. My kingdom is from another place." So his kingdom was not of the world. It wasn't like all the other kingships that they had known about on the earth. They had known the Persians, they had known the Egyptians, they had known the Romans and so forth. But his kingdom is not like one of those. It's more of the heart, and it's of the mind. It's not a physical or earthly kingdom. And the second thing we noted that Jesus talked a lot about is the kingdom was given by God. It's not fought for. It's not one that's that you conquer somebody. Like the Romans conquered Jerusalem and other places. But this kingdom is not like that. They were thinking they could still win their independence. The Jews were thinking they could still win their independence by warfare. And you remember Simon? What does it call him? Simon the what? Well, Simon the sorcerer is one. I'm talking about the apostles. The zealot. Simon the zealot. Well, what is a zealot? Have you ever wondered that, or do you know? The zealots were part of the people who were looking for a way to overthrow the government. That's what they were all about. They were rabble-rousers. They were revolutionaries. And they were extremists who wanted to overthrow the Roman government and get them off their backs. They were tired of that. They're always looking for a way to harass or challenge them. Well, that's Simon the Zealot. And thirdly, is the universal kingdom. It's a universal kingdom. And I don't know if you've really thought about it a whole lot, but the kingdom was for everybody. Not just the Jews. But the Jews thought it was just for the Jews. I mean, it was their prophets and, their law that had the teachings about the Messiah coming. But they overlooked a lot of verses. The Gentiles are mentioned a lot in Scripture. And you remember, the Jewish nation is just Abraham and his descendants through Isaac. It's just one family. Just one family. It's like Mike. If Mike was Abraham and Mary was Sarah, well, y'all look kind of like, no, I don't think so. But their lineage would be the only one that's Jews, and all the rest of us would be Gentiles. That's what God did on the earth. Well, not just everybody else in here, everybody else. Everybody else in the world, except for Abraham and Sarah. So, the Jewish nation was a small nation. But everybody, the Chinese, the Russians, whoever you want to name, God intended for them to have salvation too. So when Jesus came and offered salvation to everyone, he meant everyone, not just the Jews. And that's a different kind of kingdom, isn't it? That was a wide open kingdom. In Matthew 8, verse 5, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Well, I want you to notice, this is one of the occasions where there's a miracle involved, but I want you to notice who he's talking to, who he's talking about. It's a centurion. And that's a Roman soldier that's in charge of 100 men. He's a centurion. A Roman soldier came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home, paralyzed and in terrible suffering. Verse 7 says, Jesus said to him, I will go and heal him. The centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I'll tell this one, go, and he goes. And that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was astonished and said to those following him, I tell you the truth, I've not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Now that's pretty remarkable for Jesus to say that, because the Jews considered Jesus for them, or they considered the Messiah for them. They weren't convinced it was Jesus yet. And here Jesus says, I haven't found a Jew among you. I haven't found any Israelite that has the faith of this centurion. Well, those are fighting words. I mean, those words don't make any sense to the Jew. So they were highly, agitated at Jesus saying that. And then he went on to say, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west. What is he talking about from the east and the west? He's talking about the world over. From the east, that'd be China. We can't have any Chinese in the kingdom, can we? Well, yes, we can. So I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Well, I think not only the Jews, but I think for us, we read a story like that and we forget the context in which it was given. But Jesus was inclusive of the context. He included the Gentiles in the kingdom. He included, all the people of the earth at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, the feast, I mean, that's a big deal. When you mention Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that's a big deal to the Jews. Jesus said they'll be coming from the east and the west. Then Isaiah 49, verses 5 and 6. And now the Lord says, He who formed me in the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him and gather Israel to himself, for I'm honored in the eyes of the Lord, and my God has been my strength. He says it is too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept. I will also make you a light for the Gentiles. That's in Isaiah. And that's 600 years before Jesus came. I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. Jesus' kingdom was spiritual. It wasn't really an earthly king. And it was universal. It was for everybody, not just the Jews. So the kingdom wasn't like the other kingdoms. And he taught a lot about the heart of the kingdom. Think about the heart of the kingdom. And by this I'm talking about what he taught in all the parables, or what he taught in all the miracles that he performed, or what he taught in his life example. In Matthew 5, 6, and 7, we have the Sermon on the Mount, as you know. He taught that sermon, and then he lived those principles before everybody, so everybody could see what that sermon meant. He was here for 3 years in active ministry, living out the principles that he had taught on the Sermon on the Mount. And we understand the teachings of Jesus, and we get that. We understand somewhat the parables of Jesus, and we get that. But I also think that Jesus taught through his example. Some things that he didn't teach with parables and miracles and other things like that. And so you have a concept of the kingdom because of who Jesus was and where he went. It's not much like the religious practices of the Jews. They thought that by doing certain things and requiring that you did certain things, or requiring other people to do them, that they'd be worthy of the kingdom. That really was the mindset of the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, and the scribes. But Matthew 23, the whole chapter, is toward the Pharisees. It's as if Jesus, had his fill of the Pharisees, and he finally went off on them. He finally told them how they were, how it really was. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Verse 5 says, everything they do is done for men to see. They make their phylacteries wide and tassels on their garments long. The phylacteries is a headpiece that they printed scriptures on. That was to have it in the forefront of their minds. That's not what God intended, but that's what they did. And their phylacteries are wide as they wrote more scriptures down. They loved the place of honor at banquets and most important seats in the synagogues. They loved to be greeted in the marketplaces and have men call them rabbi. And woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees. This is verse 15. You hypocrites. You travel over land and sea to win a single convert. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. Woe to you, blind guides. That's verse 16. Verse 17, you blind fools. 19, you blind men. Jesus is agitated. And he's not very polite, I guess you would say, to the people who are this way, because they're controlling all their religion. You blind guides, verse 24, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they're full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You're like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you're full of hypocrisy and witness. So he's taking the kingdom from an external perspective, and he's bringing it all down to the center of the person, the heart of the kingdom. And it's your heart, my heart, people's hearts that make the difference. That makes you, it doesn't matter if you've done the things that he said, the heart is what really matters. Because he also said in the same chapter in verse 11, the greatest among you will be your servant. That doesn't make sense. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and who humbles himself will be exalted. And then down in verse 23, he says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, and you get this mindset. I mean, mint, dill, and cumin are just this small. That's not a field of wheat. You don't plant these things like you do those. These are just little garden herbs. But he says you're so mindful to tithe on those. But he says you're forgetting what is important. You have neglected the more important matters of the law. What is that? I mean, how could you condemn a Pharisee and say he's not keeping the law? I mean, they go to great extent to keep the letter of the law. For crying out loud, they're tithing dill, cumin, and mint. But he says you're forgetting or neglected the most important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Those things don't really have a law, do they? They're the heart of his message, though. They're the heart of the kingdom of God that Jesus came to kind of straighten out and correct. And all the times when he was teaching and all the times when he healed people, he often brought them in front of the Pharisees and healed like the guy with the lame hand. Why did he bring them up there? Why did he challenge all of their belief And he did something that they thought was a violation of the law. It's because that's what he came to do. He wrote the law, he knew what he was doing. And whereas they had reduced everything down to the fine points, he expanded it all again. And he said, how many of you have a donkey that gets stuck on the Sabbath day? What do? He said, you get it out of the ditch. So what's wrong with me healing a man on the Sabbath day? Well, they couldn't say anything back to him. They tried to catch him in the law all the time. But he always turned that back around and made them realize, I think, ultimately, that they're not following God, but they're following themselves. They were full of rituals and rules and regulations. But Jesus was about the heart of the kingdom. I'm not telling you or saying that the fine points don't matter. He says in Matthew 23, you should have done that and not neglected the other things. In other words, you should have tithing not dent. Don't tithe dents. But you tithe mint and cumin and dill. That's appropriate. But you got to also include the other parts of the law. And then I want you to think about the dominion of the kingdom, or the authority of the kingdom. Did you ever think about the miracles that Jesus performed? When is one time when the people denied what he did? They could not say, well, you weren't blind either. Or they couldn't say, you're not lame. You weren't lame for 38 years. The guy's been faking everybody out for 38 years. And now he can walk. Or, the feeding of the 5,000, which was 5,000 men. It was more like 12 or 14,000 by the time you count the women and children and other people there. And who could feed people off a sack lunch? You notice they didn't deny that happened. They never denied any miracle he ever did. And that's unlike our thoughts today. If we could do miracles, and, if I could heal somebody that's blind or lame or whatever else he did, they didn't deny it. They denied the power that he did it through. They denied him being from God. Jesus was not an ordinary person. He has authority over natural disasters. He has authority over, for instance, the sea. He was teaching all day long and he was tired. And, he taught the parable of the sower, and it was almost evening time. And he got in a boat with his apostles, sailed across the sea, and he was fast asleep. I'm sure he was asleep by the time his head hit the cushion. He was down the hold of the boat. And the sea began to roar and rumble, and lightning and all the other things. And the apostles, they were good boatmen, but they were afraid they were going to die. And they woke Jesus up, and they said, aren't you, afraid of that we're going to crash? Aren't you concerned about our lives? Aren't you, worried about crashing out here in the sea? And I'm sure Jesus, being tired, he woke up and he went upstairs and he said, peace, be still. That's not what he did. It was like, sit down and shut up. And he didn't say sit down and shut up. But you understand what I'm saying? That first he scolded the apostles, where's your faith? And then he scolded the wind and the waves. Then the apostles were afraid to say anything else to him. But they wondered, who is this man? And that's what the text says. They wondered, who is this man? Even the wind and the waves obey him. He has dominion over natural disasters. He has dominion over the devil. You remember the demoniac, the legion he's called, in Mark chapter 5? We don't have time to go through all the details. But you remember they sailed to Gennesaret, and when they got out of the boat, the demon came, or the man came running over to Jesus. And I'm sure the apostles were, they were protecting Jesus, right? So they intercepted the demon. No, that's not what they did at all. They went back to the boat if they did anything. But the demoniac begged Jesus not to send them into the abyss, is what it says. And the demons, 1,000 of them, knew who Jesus was. And the demoniac was out of his mind crazy. He had bits of rope and chain, I'm sure, from being chained up and rope tied. But he broke all the chains away. And he was naked, running through a graveyard. It's not the kind of person you want to meet. But Jesus said, you get out of here. Leave the man. And they went out with a shriek, and they went into a herd of pigs. And I like to say they committed suicide. Because I'm from Alabama. But that shows his power or authority over the demons. Well, the demons knew who he was. But knowing Jesus was not a ticket into anything. They didn't know his power. Who was this guy that did this? It's Jesus. And he had dominion over disease. You remember when he was walking with his apostles, he was teaching and other things. There were a lot of people around. And Jairus sent a messenger over, said, you got to come save my daughter. And Jairus was a Gentile. But so he goes on his 911 call. He says, I got to go to the next town, and she is about to die. So he's on a 911 call. When the woman comes up behind Jesus in the crowd and reaches out and touches the hem of his garment. And Jesus knew that the power had left from him. And he stopped and he called attention to her and he talked to her. That's a great, great story. But the fact that Jesus healed the woman was remarkable because she had spent all her money on doctors for 12 years. Nobody had done any good. She was unclean too. But Jesus called her daughter. Gave her a place to belong, somebody to belong to. He made her speak in front of the crowd. When she wanted to be secretive and by herself. But you can't be secretive and by yourself and be with Jesus. He had power over every kind of disease there was. Not just the hemorrhaging woman, but over blind people, over lame people. I believe that instead of him creating big events in order to heal people, in order to lift his name up, the reason that we have a single person here and a single person there is because Satan involves himself in people's lives and plagues them and afflicts them. And I believe that Jesus just couldn't stand that. So when a person was in front of him and they begged him to heal them, he healed them because he was concerned about them and cared about them. He had compassion on them. He had power over disease. And he has power over death, dominion or authority over death. Because he was on a 911 call. And he stopped. And he stopped long enough that the little girl died. And they sent word, don't bother the teacher, tell him not to come. She's dead. He said, nah, she's not dead. And he went on over to the house, and they were weeping and mourning and crying because the girl's dead. But Jesus took Peter and John, I think, in the room with him, got everybody else out, and he raised the little girl back to life. Well, that's not the only time. It's not the first time. But it's just enough to show us that Jesus has power, authority, dominion over death. Well, we could go on forever, but we won't. We'll stop with this point. That the difference in this kingdom and the other kingdoms is that it was an eternal kingdom. It was an eternal kingdom. It wasn't going to come and go. It wasn't going to last as long as people were here and alive and whatever. In John 3:16, 3:15 is the first place in John 3. He says it's an eternal kingdom. In John 3:16, which most everybody knows, he says it's an eternal kingdom. In John 3:36, he says it's an eternal kingdom. And that seemed to be a doctrine that he was preaching and trying to get the people on board with. We kind of on board with it more than the apostles were even. They didn't understand, but we do. That Jesus' kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. Jesus' kingdom is a heavenly, spiritual kingdom. And that it lasts forever. Forever. You remember in 1 Thessalonians when it's talking about the second coming of Christ? It says the dead in Christ will rise to meet him first. And we who are alive will meet him in the air. And that's where we will be with him forever. Forever. This is an eternal kingdom. Well, there's a lot more that Jesus taught and a lot more that we could say about the kingdom. But that's probably enough to chew on for one lesson. Are you a part of it? Are you a part of the kingdom? And if you have become a part of the kingdom, are you a faithful subject? If you have any needs, please come as we stand and sing.